Well, the 1952 presidential election season rolled around like presidential election seasons do. And this is going to be a wide open election because President Truman decided not to run for reelection. Now, uh, there had been a constitutional amendment passed, proposed, ratified, and everything in 1951 that stated that no one can be elected president more than twice. So that's to prevent, someone like FDR coming along getting elected four times. It also specified that if you're the vice president and the president dies and you take over, and you're in office for more than 2 years, that counts as one term. So under that amendment, Truman would not have been allowed to run for reelection. But the amendment specified that there was a grandfather clause. It didn't apply to the person who was president already. It would apply to the next president. But he decided not to run. His popularity was way down because of the Korean War. So now both major parties are going to have to find a candidate. Enter this guy who we have met before, Dwight David Eisenhower, General of the U.S. Army. In fact, the commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II. His nickname was Ike, so the campaign slogan would become "We like Ike." Now, everybody liked Ike because essentially he was the guy in charge of the military of the army in Europe with the winning of World War II over the Nazis. So he was extremely popular. He was not a real political person. Um, in fact, no one even knew what political party, if any, that he belonged to. He had been raised in Kansas, and his mother was actually a Jehovah's Witness, which meant that she was a pacifist. So she was deeply disappointed that he joined the army and went to West Point, and also that that particular denomination doesn't believe in getting involved in politics in any way. So he didn't have a political background. No one knew what party he was, so both parties wanted him. Back in 1948, actually, the Democratic Party tried to get him to run in a primary against sitting President Truman because, remember, it looked to everybody like Truman was going to lose. But he didn't. And the Republicans were after him at the same time, trying to get him to run on their ticket. He was convinced to do so in 1952. There was a campaign called Draft Ike, in which the Republicans basically said they're going to choose him as their candidate, whether he wants to run or not. So he went with the Republicans. He was a lifelong military man, obviously, and his belief was that the Republican Party would be better for defense of the United States. So he came aboard as a candidate in the Republican primary. His primary opponent, his principal opponent in the Republican primary, was Robert A. Taft, for whom the Taft-Hartley Bill, or Act, because it passed, is named. Son of former President William Howard Taft, senator from Ohio, extremely conservative, had been one of the most outspoken conservative voices during the FDR administration, one of the people most opposed to Roosevelt's New Deal policies. And he had tried before. He had come close in 1948 to getting the nomination, but he lost out to Dewey. Also, he was an isolationist. So now he's trying to get it again, and you have to think that once Eisenhower declared he was willing to be a candidate, Robert Taft probably just took his ball and went home because he's not going to be able to beat Eisenhower, and in fact he didn't. Eisenhower did get the nomination. Perhaps a consolation prize, not really, but maybe in a certain point of view to Taft is that in the 1970s he was named in a poll taken in the U.S. Senate as one of the five greatest U.S. senators in history. The other four, and they weren't numbered in any order. The other four were Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who was a progressive Republican in the early 1900s, and then the other three were the big three senators of the 19th century from the 1820s, 1840s, right around there, referred to as the Great Triumvirate. Henry Clay of Kentucky, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. There they are, your top five. A sexier lineup could not be found anywhere. The Democratic Party chose as their candidate the governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, whose grandfather, also named Adlai Stevenson, had been vice president under Grover Cleveland. Stevenson in the primary beat out Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver. Perhaps you will remember him from the Senate hearings on comic books in the 1950s. He had been campaigning wearing a coonskin cap. I'm kind of glad he didn't win. Eisenhower's running mate was Senator Richard Nixon from California, who had become nationally famous as the face of communist hunters there in the House Un-American Activities Committee when he had been in the House. Now he's in the Senate from California. This was not necessarily Eisenhower's choice that Ike thought would be the perfect sidekick. It was rather the choice of the party, which is usually how it happens. The party usually has a very, very strong voice in who gets selected as a running mate because they want the ticket to win, right? So they want someone as running mate usually who is very, very different from the person running for president. So they'll appeal maybe to people that the president candidate might not appeal as much to, right? So that's why it was kind of considered weird in 1992 when Bill Clinton chose Al Gore as his running mate because they were both white male Democrats from the South. That's also why John McCain in 2008 didn't get his wish for running mate. He wanted as his running mate Joe Lieberman, whom he thought very highly of and whom he aligned up with on a lot of things, but who happened to be a Democrat, not a Republican. He had been Al Gore's running mate. And the party just absolutely wouldn't allow that. And at the last minute, they had to find somebody else real quick, and they wound up with Sarah Palin. Anyway, Richard Nixon is the running mate. The party leaders thought that Nixon would be the perfect running mate for Eisenhower because Eisenhower was a really nice guy and everybody liked him. And the party wanted people to vote for him because he's a really nice guy, right? Um, so he needed a really not nice guy as his partner. And so Nixon's job was kind of to be the attack dog. Anything negative that had to be said about the opposition, Eisenhower didn't say it because he didn't want to look bad. So Nixon would go ahead and say it because he looked bad already, essentially. So you've probably seen enough cop shows to realize to recognize this approach. Good cop, bad cop, right? Enough episodes, hopefully, of Law and Order or CSI or whatever, in which you know that when they're trying to get a witness or a criminal to confess, they bring in the mean guy to scare them, and then the nice guy that they will confide in and trust. So that was the party's hope, the Republican Party's hope of how this duo would work. Now brace yourselves because I know this might shock you. Over the course of that presidential election, Richard Nixon was accused of corruption. Apparently, he was accused of accepting $18,000 from private donors that were not that were donated directly to him rather than to the campaign. So he went on television, which was, a relatively new thing for any politician to do at the time, and gave a little speech in which he defended himself, in which he said that he's going to come clean because honesty is the best policy, and he assured the nation that this money was all used for the campaign so as to save taxpayers money, and that none of it was for his personal use. And to give evidence of his honesty, he pointed out that his wife doesn't wear a fancy fur coat. She wears, quote, a respectable Republican cloth coat. He did, however, admit that he accepted one gift for his personal use, a Cocker Spaniel named Checkers. And essentially, he said, so if you think that I should break my daughter's heart by taking away her puppy and giving it back, well, then I guess I'm just going to have to be guilty because I'm keeping the puppy. And by the time all was said and done, he had essentially he had people feeling sorry for him and admiring his honesty, which in light of what happens later in history is kind of interesting. Also, it's interesting that early on here, 1952, running for vice president, Richard Nixon very effectively uses television to get elected. This was the first significant example of anyone using television in a presidential campaign. And it seemed kind of weird to some people. In fact, one newspaper editorialist said that it was that it's like they were, quote, selling candidates like they were toothpaste, which the ads that would come on television to convince people to buy toothpaste, this same application being used for politics, just seemed weird. Political use of television was not the only innovation that Richard Nixon brought to the Republican Party in the early 1950s. He was essentially, and in that Checkers speech, he was doing this. He was trying to change the image of the Republican Party, and the image of the Republican Party over the previous decades had sort of morphed into this image of a party that was geared toward business and geared toward the upper class, really. That the Democratic Party was usually the one that was considered to be the working class party. And so he wanted to change that perception, the perception that the Republican Party is going to protect big business no matter what, to the exclusion of the working class. He wanted the Republican Party to be seen as the party of, in his words, quote, the forgotten man, that is, the working poor, which was Nixon's background. He grew up in California, very, very poor, actually. His parents were Quakers. He was raised a Quaker, which is just, defies belief. But anyway, the forgotten man, that type of imagery he would use again in the late 1960s when he is running for president. So he wanted to have this populist approach to appeal to the broadest range of people out there, of middle class and working class people, to without freaking out the business interests that did support the Republican Party, right? So it's not going to be one of these full bore leftist calls for the elevation of the working man, but he was trying to bring those two elements together: business, essentially, right, business and labor. And the picture that I have here is sort of what the stereotype of the Republican was at that time. Now, I am often disheartened when I show this picture to my students and no one has any idea who this is. It's Two characters from Gilligan's Island, if you're familiar, those seven-stranded castaways that went on a 3-hour tour and got shipwrecked. The wealthy couple, Thurston Howell III and his wife Lovey, always talking about, at least the husband, always talking about how much he hated Democrats. And, he was very wealthy and he lit his cigars with money, you know. That type of stereotype is what Nixon was trying to work against. And actually, back in 2012, when Mitt Romney was the Republican candidate, um, he sort of was a throwback in some ways to some of those earlier perceptions of the party, and some of his critics referred to him as Thurston Romney III. And as you can see, the combination of Eisenhower and Nixon worked. Eisenhower ran away with the election. It was a huge, huge victory. However, take note, as in most of the elections that we've already looked at, the Democrat takes the South, the the solid South, so that most Southern states, it seems, would much rather vote for a liberal Yankee from Illinois than for essentially the greatest living American hero who won World War II if the Yankee from Illinois is a Democrat. At 62 years of age, Eisenhower was at that time one of the oldest presidents ever elected. I think he was the second oldest president ever elected. That was beaten by Ronald Reagan when Reagan got reelected in 1984, and Donald Trump is the oldest person ever to have been elected at this point. So that puts Eisenhower down to fourth place. Nixon, who was 39 years old at this time, um, has sometimes been called the first modern vice president. That gets applied in a lot of ways to a lot of different people. In his case, it's because he was very active as vice president. The traditional role of the vice president was, kind of hang out and see if the president dies, and then go to work if he does. But Nixon was very active. In fact, Eisenhower basically put Nixon in charge of most domestic matters, and Eisenhower took charge in the international matters, which is where he excelled. So not only did the Republican ticket win the White House, but they also won both houses of Congress. Remember, they had been out of power in Congress for 16 years during the FDR administration after the Depression, and then they had kind of come roaring back in 1946. This time, they win both houses of Congress, but just barely. And 4 years later, spoiler alert, Eisenhower will get reelected, but the Republicans lose both houses to the Democrats in 1956. Turns out, Eisenhower also wanted to change the image and the approach of the Republican Party. He wanted to move past the traditions of, quote, Hoover conservatism, that kind of unfettered, unregulated capitalism of the 1920s. Um, that the pendulum swung the other way when the Depression came on toward Roosevelt. So what this meant for Eisenhower was embracing the New Deal, not dismantling it. That's what a lot of conservatives had hoped would happen if they ever got the chance that they could undo all the stuff that Roosevelt had done that they viewed as socialist, or at the very least damaging to business. Eisenhower believed that many of the programs that Roosevelt put in place were positive programs and helpful programs, and he believed that the American people supported them. And so stop trying to undo the New Deal, essentially, and work with it and move forward from there. In fact, he actually increased subsidies to farmers and expansion of Social Security to farmers. When Social Security was introduced, it was for hourly laborers, so it didn't really help farmers. He actually applied it to farmers. As we will see, he expanded civil rights and put in place the interstate highway system, which is sort of like the ultimate project for infrastructure, the sort of thing that Roosevelt had been doing in the 1930s and that Congress tried to get Hoover to do, and he wouldn't. Which, if you're ever driving down the interstate, every once in a while you'll pass a sign that informs you you were on the Eisenhower highway system, interstate highway system. So that was a lot of money the federal government spent building those interstates, which of course put a lot of people to work, yet still it was a big government expense. So how do you justify that to people who were extremely conservative? And again, Eisenhower still had to work with the Republican Congress. So how do you justify that? He justified it by saying, dadgum communists, there could be a nuclear war at any time. Atomic bombs could be falling. And if that happened, troops would have to be mobilized. The National Guard would have to be mobilized. Emergency vehicles would have to quickly get from one city to another. And that's why this interstate highway system was needed. And that worked. And it got done. So Eisenhower was really not very similar to the quote unquote new conservatives, because the new conservatives thought the old conservatives weren't conservative enough. Eisenhower felt that the old conservatives were too conservative. So his approach was a moderate approach, moving more toward the middle. And there are still some people today, some people who are older than me, maybe 10 years or more older than me and beyond, who identify themselves, if you talk to them, as Eisenhower Republicans. An Eisenhower Republican is a very moderate Republican, very much kind of in the middle of the road. And a lot of this is demonstrated in a letter that Eisenhower wrote to a friend of his on November 8th, 1954. So this is the President of the United States, the Republican President of the United States. He said, "Now it is true that I believe this country is following a dangerous trend when it permits too great a degree of centralization of governmental functions. I oppose this. In some instances, the fight is a rather desperate one. But to attain any success, it is quite clear that the federal government cannot avoid or escape responsibilities which the mass of the people firmly believe should be undertaken by it. The political processes of our country are such that if a rule of reason is not applied in this effort, we will lose everything, even to a possible and drastic change in the Constitution. This is what I mean by my constant insistence upon moderation in government. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are H.L. Hunt. You possibly know his background. By the way, if you don't, he was the first owner of the Kansas City Chiefs. And a few other Texas oil millionaires, and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible, and they're stupid. Now, that's not the sort of thing that you expect from the Republican president, but he was an Eisenhower Republican.